Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast. We are your hosts, Justin Ribeiro and Leon Revel. Leon, how's it going today?
Hello, everybody. Really well, thank you.
So we're going to talk about Web Components Gold Standard today. But before we get started, we've got a new segment we're trying out called This Week in the Web. So I'm going to throw it over to Leon for 2 minutes of interesting web news. Leon.
Thank you very much, Justin. So first up, we've got some great news, which is that on Friday, it was announced that the Web Components JS version 1 polyfills have got merged into master. So that's really good news. I think it's going to kind of lower the barrier to using the latest specifications of Web Components. So really, really happy to see that. Next up is Jordan Last published an article called Universal Web Components, which was basically a follow-up from his talk he delivered at Web Components Remote Conference, which basically talks about using Web Components for more than UI in the browser, even going as far as creating a Node Express server with them, which is really interesting. So we'll drop that link in the show notes. Another one this Monday, it was stated that WebAssembly is now ready for browser use. It's gone into MVP status, and that should be available in Firefox and Chrome by the end of the month, which is very interesting. And to follow that, there's been a new release of Firefox 52, which actually already has support for WebAssembly in there, which is brilliant. Next up, the AMP conference in New York is in full swing, which is, really interesting conference. I know Justin's been tweeting a lot about, some of the really good content there. And Alex Russell said that AMP is the most successful Web Components library in the world, which is kind of an interesting statement. And finally, for this week in web, is Samsung's internet browser. Its beta is now got a progressive web app indication badge. So that means if you're viewing a progressive web app on this the Samsung browser, you know that it supports the progressive web app features, which is kind of nice to see, more browsers other than Chrome supporting the kind of progressive web app kind of feature. And that's everything. Back over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting things going around the web. So we'll start this segment at the beginning of most episodes as we try to collect interesting things. If you see interesting things on the web, please be sure to tweet us and let us know so we can get it in the show notes as well as into the segment. So let's move on to our topic of the day, Web Components Gold Standard. Leon, you and I, we like the Web Components. We did just run a conference about that. AMP is in full swing, as you mentioned, and, AMP is around this Web Component standard web programs. And we've got two wonderful people here on the show today to talk about this very topic. Please welcome Rob and Jan to the show. Rob, Jan, good to see you all. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you.
For those people out there who don't quite know who you are, though I think if you're in the sort of web community, you may know Rob and Jan. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Jan Miksovsky, and I'm a partner with Rob. We have a company called Component Kitchen that focuses on promoting and developing web components. I'm a designer and an engineer and an entrepreneur. I've been working in the software industry for about 30 years, and quite excited about the state of web components right now. It's been probably coming up on 5 years that I've been following the development of the standard, and it's great to see them as things have been showing up in the browsers to be able to take advantage of them. So I'm excited.
I'm Rob Bearman. I've been working with Jan on Component Kitchen for about 3 years. Although he and I go way back, I met Jan my first day at Microsoft back in 1991, back when we both had thick black hair. So that was a while ago. And my career goes back to the 80s and the early days of desktop software, where names like Borland and Novell and Lotus were prominent. So I've been working in the web component space with Jan recently after moving off of mobile apps in the Android and iOS space.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you both for being on the show today. So we're going to talk about the gold standard checklist for web components. For those out there who don't know what this checklist is about, who would like to sort of explain a little bit about what exactly this draft is about?
Sure. So the checklist is really a guide for people creating web components that they're hoping other people are going to reuse. So Rob and I, in the course of our work at Component Kitchen, discovered a problem a couple of years ago, which was we noticed that there was as people were beginning to create the first web components and publish them on GitHub or on catalogs, like now we have webcomponents.org as a catalog where you can publish components. As people were doing that, we felt like they needed some guidance in what they needed to do to make their component really reusable. And we can get into some of the reasons why they need that guidance. But the general idea was to take the behavior of the standard HTML elements and articulate what behaviors developers and users expect of those elements, and write that up in a checklist. And when you're creating a web component, you can go through the checklist and make sure that your web component is every bit of as reliable and solid as a standard HTML element.
There's nothing magical about this list except to look at the behaviors and the expectations of the use of native HTML elements and sort of strip those attributes out and put it into this sort of categorized list form. What's up there today is by no means complete. And so it's a growing list, and it derives from an understanding of what makes the web component that you build generally reusable with the same sort of responses that you would expect from a native HTML element.
Yeah, it's an incredibly useful resource because it's really difficult to understand the intricacies of native elements. Like there's the things that happen. Obviously, we're talking with yourself and Jan. It often surprises me on when you describe how a native element actually works. You're kind of like, oh, I wouldn't expect that. So it's really nice to have this kind of resource to kind of see and understand those behaviors. Because really, when we're building web components, they're just new DOM elements, really. So they need to behave as web users would expect them to behave, and as developers would as well. So it's important to kind of understand how these native elements work and understand how you can kind of recreate those behaviors for your custom elements.
When a developer or a development shop is approaching web components, there's a wide range of issues that they're considering. Often it's taken just from an architectural approach. How do we as an organization make modular code elements available for reuse within our application suite, or potentially just within separate pages of our applications? So thinking broadly about reuse covers a number of issues, from just architecturally within the context of an application to sharing that code bundle expressed as a component within other teams within the organization. And then at a higher level, just generally across the industry, if a component is intended to be shared for general reuse. And so the gold standard applies greatly toward the latter, although it can be used to great effect specifically for even within an organization itself.
Yeah, so there's lots of stuff in the gold standard. So kind of more specifically, how did you kind of come up with that list? Like, obviously, like you said, it's obviously nowhere complete, but kind of how have you, and if nobody's seen this already, there's a lot in there, to say it's not complete. I mean, there's so much great information.
I feel like alcohol and crying was involved. Like, at some point, a list of this size, engineering-wise, requires these two things to happen.
Yeah, I've heard some people say, like, can you just give, can the list be shorter? Like, well, so there's Leon, to answer your question, I can share a story. A few years ago, Rob and I were trying to build our own web component catalog to see if there was the potential for a business behind that, something along the lines of like Yelp, but for components. And So as part of that, we had this little marketing idea, which was we would have a blog post each week featuring a web component of the week. And so in order to generate that, each week I would look through our catalog of all the web components that were registered at that time on Bower, and I would try and pick out an interesting one and write about it. And to do the review of the component justice, I felt obligated to actually try and use the component instead of just relying on the demo that the component author had provided. And I made this very sad discovery, which was that it would usually take an hour or two to find a web component that would even work outside of its original context. So I sometimes just doing a git clone of the component repo and then trying to run it, like sometimes even that wouldn't work. But even in the cases where it would, if I tried to take the component out of the HTML page that had been specifically designed for it, the demo, and tried to use it as I might in a real application, all kinds of things would go wrong. The component turns out I needed to add some script tags to my HTML page to load some dependency that the component had that it wasn't declaring, or the component had some bizarre API where you were supposed to invoke a bunch of cryptic methods on it to get it to do sort of its typical default thing. Like even the default thing turned out to be hard to do. And so after doing this for maybe 4 or 5 weeks, we finally abandoned this this idea of trying to review and feature a web component of the week. It was just too hard to find one that was good and worth people's time. Now that was a few years ago, and I think there's been as web components have gotten implemented, as the support for them has been rolled out across other browsers, some of these issues have gone away. People are, I think, maybe taking web components more seriously now, so that's an advantage. But I think the root cause of that disappointment we had is still there, which is that when you are writing a component, you're relying on these, you tend to focus on these 2 standard shadow DOM and custom elements as a way of registering your component with the browser and getting it to participate in the life cycle of an element on the page. And those are absolutely necessary. Like that's what makes web components work. But it turns out those are not sufficient to satisfy someone's expectations for how that thing is going to work. And so, in the course of doing this little experiment of trying to review components, I started making a list of all the things they were doing wrong, and sort of figured, well, okay, let's try and flip that and have it be positive. What are the things that they should be doing right? And so if we found a component that somehow was disappointing, we try and articulate, exactly what that was and compile those in a list. We shared that list with Google. They thought it was pretty interesting, and so that led to the creation of the repo on GitHub and the, sort of trying to get that going as its own project.
Yeah, I mean, UI is hard. I mean, I think when we talk about components as a whole, like even if you look at your native platforms and things like that, where there is not necessarily a great deal of variety, so to speak, when it comes to web components and building things that have that interoperability. The interoperability portion seems to be okay, but there is something lost amongst it. I know that even for myself, like writing UI components that are going to behave correctly takes a little bit of thinking. Like it's not something that you just willy-nilly decide, you know what, it's a UI component day. I wonder how this will work across the board. Vanilla custom seems a lot easier to me as a whole. And the standard in terms of this golden list really speaks to a lot of these sort of gotchas, right? I mean, there are a lot of places you can misstep when you start to think about building things as components. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different problems that come up with reuse. Some of them are just, there are conventions that we've gotten used to in
interacting with HTML. Like that's what we all understand. And so when someone gives us a new element, we expect it to work like all the standard ones, but there are sort of expectations there. Like one that I like to focus on is how flexible HTML is. So you can take pretty much any two elements and put one inside the other. And usually the combination works. I mean, at a minimum, it won't crash. And you can probably predict what the result's going to be, and it might even be useful. But when someone's creating a web component, a lot of times they've got a very specific scenario in mind. So they're trying to create, for example, a carousel. And in their mind, they're trying to use it to feature a set of images for, I don't know, real estate listings or something. And so they have maybe photographs, and that's what they want to have be the children of that component. But there are many other things you can do with a carousel. People build, like a good example might be the intro tutorial in a number of mobile apps. When you first run the app, might be a 3-page little tutorial that you swipe through and you see little dots at the bottom, and it's basically a carousel, but it's, it might be all text. And so if someone's designing that carousel component and they're assuming that the children are image elements, that assumption will get baked in a bunch of places and then prevent someone from using it elsewhere. So I think that's, part of the complexity here is sort of stepping back from the original context in which a component was designed and beginning to think more broadly about what other people might want to do with it.
There's been a concept that I've noticed throughout my career in software development. I would label it delight. When you're working with an API set, or you're working with a library, or in this case, you're working with web components, there's a notion as a developer that when you're initially learning something, to the extent that that platform allows for great flexibility, you're not familiar with the particulars of it, but you can get something up and going, and it just works. And even if you realize later that architecturally you kind of did it wrong, but things can blow up in your face, things generally work as you would anticipate them to be. And this concept covers from APIs to libraries, web components, and all. And it's a somewhat amorphous quality. What makes something a delight to work with? Within the web component space, the gold standard is sort of a distillation of those items that if you do implement them, it makes your bundle a delight to work with. Because you don't have to guess, you don't have to study the documentation to understand you have to do A and B before you do C. These are not the kinds of things that you would expect with native HTML elements either. That's why, as Jan was saying, you just sort of have this expectation of being able to have composition and layout and things that just work even if you're naive in the use of them. And so the gold standard really is a long list of items that go towards spelling out what makes a system very flexible and easy to use.
One question I have for you guys, Justin and Leon, is I think it's interesting to consider the difference in experience you have if, let's say, you're going to look for a node module on the back end to do some task. Recently Rob and I were working on something, and we wanted to get a markdown processor that was going to be able to take markdown and format it, transform it into HTML. And, so we have this experience, you go to NPM, you search for something, there's going to be, for any given problem, you're going to find a bunch of hits, but there will be like 2 or 3 really standout modules that, tens of thousands of people use. And any of them will probably be fine. Like you can pick one, maybe you pick the one that's most popular, or it uses, parts of the stack that you already use, something like that. And you incorporate it into your app. And, unless you're doing something really crazy with Markdown, that processor is probably going to meet your needs. There might be edge cases and bugs and things that, the community knows about and wants to fix. But for basic usage, if you just have, headings and bullets in your Markdown, it's probably going to work fine. And then I, think about take that experience and translate that to the UI space. Like, if you're trying to solve a UI problem, like you want a menu bar for your website, and you imagine going out and looking for one, like, I don't know, you probably have to brace yourself and set aside like a day or two of struggling to find something that's going to meet your needs.
Yeah, I feel that pain every once in a while when I'm looking for something in particular. I mean, webcomponents.org, which just got re-released, I think is a little bit better at this, particularly with the notion of collections of things. I like the collections attribute of it. I think it's a little bit easier to find things that ideally interoperably work together, and that might help if I'm building something off the shelf. But there is a certain amount of pain, because I think the when you bring your own requirements to a particular component where I have a particular need for that thing, so like the Markdown example, that can get tricky. So an example that I kind of use around Markdown is that I had some code blocks, and I was building this experimental PWA thing that kind of powers like my blog. And I was just purpleizing it and decided, you know what, I want to do some things. I need to render some code. Oh, well, I can use Prism, like Prism.js. You know, if you're not out there, you know, Prism, pretty standard thing. Lovely little lib. I'll use Prism for this. I wonder if there's a component for it. Oh, there is a component. Great. I'm gonna drop some code into the content portion of this. I'll be good to go. HTML for the win. And then no. Sad failure's face. And I was like, oh, that doesn't operate quite the way I think it is. And then you go down the rabbit hole. And I have this every couple of weeks where you find a component that you think does what you want it to do, and then you make that guess to the composition of it. I want to use this declaratively. Just go work, do the thing. Doesn't do it. Source code pull. What is it doing? Oh, it's doing this. I don't want it to do that. Fork or rewrite? I'll just rewrite it. Yeah. And then you go down that next path, and then now you have a new component that is yours. Yeah. And ideally does the thing that you want it to do. But again, you always end up with that balance, right? Where these were my requirements to make it do this thing. And particularly for UI, with processing stuff, I don't see it as much. Like I can go and say, if I want an Ajax, I can do that. Like if I need lists, like I don't even go look for lists. Like Iron List is my thing. Like, I don't know if you guys have used Iron List, but Iron List from a performance standpoint is amazing. Like that's my favorite web component at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I see that pain though. Like you go and you do the search, you find something. Yes, it worked this time, but it didn't work for this other thing, and then you end up with this other path.
I had actually a story about Iron List a couple years ago. It was actually, I think, in the same meeting when we were talking to Google about turning this checklist into the gold standard. There was a guy, Kevin, who was in the room, who was the original author of the Iron List component. And I compared that component. I said, you know, this is kind of a revolutionary web component. And I compared it to this bit of history. So I don't know if you remember this story a number of years ago. There were these people in Italy climbing up in the Alps, and they discovered this guy frozen in the ice. And they call the police because they think it's, you know, there's been a murder or something. And it turns out, no, he's like 9,000 years old. And this frozen guy, Otzi, I think is his name, tells us a lot about what the culture was like at that time. And he has like, you know, clothes and sandals and all kinds of stuff that was preserved in the ice, including he has this axe head, this metal axe head. And this was like a really fascinating discovery. And several scientists commented on this axe head as being sort of a kind of seminal object in human civilization, because it was one of the first things that could be made where you couldn't understand it if you were given it. Like if someone just hands it to you, like if you handed, I don't know, if someone handed you grass sandals, like maybe you don't know how to make them, but you could look at it and go, oh, I kind of see what's happening. They're weaving this stuff together. Like I don't know, I guess I could make one of these if someone gave me this and I could copy it. But if someone just hands you an axe head, like you can't copy that thing. Like you have to know how it was made. And so, and it's, you know, amazingly useful. And I said Iron List was the first, it's like the bronze Otzi axe head of the web component space. Because a lot of the things that were done before that were like, here's, paper button or whatever. Here, it's okay, it's cool, but it's mostly just applying styling, and it has some properties. I don't know, it has a ripple or whatever, like a few tricks, but you can kind of guess how it works. And then if you look at the code, you can kind of see. But if you look at the code for Iron List, like you can even have the code in front of you, and it takes hours of digesting it to figure out like how it's doing what it's doing. Like, oh, it's creating only a subset of the elements and then reusing them, and it's using transforms to put them in the right place so it looks like they're in the scrolling list. There's a bunch of work that thing does. And so that's like a great example of a seminal web component where there was this problem building a high performance virtual list that could get packaged up as a web component and reused. And we don't need to understand, we don't really want to understand how that thing works. So I think that's a great example of web components at their best.
Yeah.
Jan, I thought you were going to mention that they found on Otzi's body the first W3C specification for the shadow DOM. You didn't go there.
Wow.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, that was a fascinating.
If Danny was here, Danny would diss. We would argue about Shadow DOM. We're not going to do that today. I know you're listening, Danny, because you're stuck in a meeting. Actually, I hope you're not listening. You're stuck in a meeting.
Yeah, I'd like to go back onto the question about kind of why is UI reuse so difficult in comparison to kind of server side things and that kind of stuff. So if we kind of back up a bit before web components, so before the Shadow DOM, you had a few problems when you wanted to reuse something. And number one is finding something with the same library and same kind of technology stack that you were using. You've got 4 million trillion JavaScript libraries created every month, and you're probably using one of them, and then you've got to find a kind of component that kind of fits in that ecosystem. And then you do, so let's say you're using Angular 1x, for example, that was kind of a big directive ecosystem, and there's lots of really good directives and modules and things for that. So you get hold of that thing and you use it in your project, but there's no real way to create truly encapsulated components there. Yes, you can pretty much encapsulate the JavaScript, but then you've got the styling problems and you've got all these other kind of issues there. And the promise of web components solves a lot of these problems. So now moving into the web components ecosystem, you've got the Shadow DOM, so you can properly encapsulate everything. And then hopefully you've got an abstraction layer in terms of how you communicate with the thing. So it's not tied into a particular library or a framework. You've now got not only a way to encapsulate the styling and the JavaScript, but a way to standardize how you communicate with the things, using attributes or events and those kind of things in a very similar way to how all the other elements we're used to using. So obviously with web components, we're in a much better place to do that. But there's still the problem that we've kind of been discussing is, I need to solve a particular problem. So I'm going to build a web component which solves that particular problem. It still doesn't mean that because I'm using the Shadow DOM or because I'm using these encapsulation kind of ideas, it still doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly in all the different environments. And I think that's where the gold standard comes in. It's getting more people to use that kind of checklist to improve the quality of their components so that they are going to be more reusable. But there's a big challenge because people working at companies, they've got time pressures. Everybody wants to build reusable code, but often don't have the time to do it. So it's a big challenge. I don't know whether anybody's got any thoughts on that particular subject.
I think UI is a special kind of challenge when it comes to reuse. I think partly we've got we haven't had the right the platform to be able to share things. And the key thing about that is that in any kind of sharing economy, you want to have network effects. You want to have, if you've got people sharing, you get these benefits of n squared, and you want a really big n so that you have an enormous n squared, and that'll suddenly make it worthwhile to sweat the details on something like, creating the perfect drop-down combo box or whatever. Without that, if you've only got a pool of, a few hundred or even a few thousand people that are the potential audience for a UI widget, then it's, people will go and create some widgets, but they're not going to be able to afford, obsessing over every little detail on something that's that might be really important. Whereas if you can boost that audience into the tens or hundreds of thousands, then now it's worthwhile, and so people will be able to dedicate time because they need it for their project, or because they just really care about it. So I think we were, at least with the adoption of Shadow DOM and custom elements in the browsers, we've got the potential for large audiences. So that, I think that'll make a big difference. There's also just a challenge in UI that people we haven't had a great decomposition of user interface into primitives that really let you sort of build up interesting things from good parts. So it turns out the HTML elements are they're great primitives, but they're not enough. Like, one primitive that's missing from the platform right now is some kind of overlay or pop-up feature that lets you say, hey, I want this thing to appear on top of everything else, regardless of its stacking context or other factors. And people are going to try and do that with web components, but it's challenging because that's not in the platform. And oftentimes, in the past, there have been great breakthroughs when people have been able to come up with a good decomposition of a complex space into the right set of primitives. So I think one interesting, sort of historical perspective, I look at, there have been different programming languages, for example. Like, I love there's a story behind the original Lisp implementation in 1960 or so by McCarthy, where he was really interested in this mathematical challenge of, like, how do you take everything that's programmable and create the smallest possible programming language that will let you do everything. And until that time, when people were writing programming languages, if they needed something, they would just add a feature to the language itself, Fortran or COBOL or whatever. And McCarthy was one of the people who came along and said, well, actually, I think I can build an interesting programming language with just 7 statements or so. It was something on that order. I need a conditional. I need to be able to, assign things. I need some kind of a function construct. And, with this tiny handful of things, he could build up anything. And other, systems, I think Unix itself is a good example of, decomposing stuff into interesting primitives, and that leads to this explosion in what's possible. So I think we've been held back on reusing UI because we haven't had a great set of primitives for things like overlays or swiping gestures or other things like that. So as those come together and we work out what we need, we'll be able to build more interesting, higher quality reusable components. Leon, you also mentioned one thing, which is there's a lot of detail in there that is easy to overlook. I had the opportunity in the 90s to work on Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Office. And people, when they use Office, they're not really thinking about the huge number of person hours that went into designing the toolbar of an Office application. But that's like a project team by itself for multiple years to create that ribbon in the Office apps. And tons and tons of studies and different designs and explorations. There's a lot of work that goes into that. And a lot of people approach UI, the creation of UI, with this mentality of saying, well, how hard could it be? Like, I'm just going to make a button and slap together and it should work. So I think that as people try and solve these problems, they discover how hard they are.
Well, and I think it's an interesting sort of thing. I mean, the web has gotten so much more in terms of primitives now to deal with and work with. I mean, obviously we have sort of Houdini in the works. The web platform as a whole, I mean, we had, I think dialogue at one point was actually part of the HTML spec, as was list. But those things never sort of came to fruition either. But all of a sudden, now with web components and some new primitives we have on the platform, all of a sudden maybe you don't necessarily need all those things, right? Maybe we can get away with saying, oh, well, I now have enough tools again to build up that thing. And I think the checklist speaks to a lot of that, actually, because if you go through that checklist now, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do, you can see just how much you can get done with web components as a whole, which a lot of people I don't think quite understand in terms of the way things like properties change, or, are you dealing with your render performance? Well, why would I worry about that? Well, because, we have mobile platforms and stuff. Did you think about that? Well, how can I deal with that? Well, here are some primitives to do this. Like, all of a sudden, it sort of pushes forward the conversation of what the web can be as a whole, other than just saying my component should meet all these criteria.
Yeah, I'm hoping that people look at that and, it really sort of prods them into thinking about how to create stuff that can be reused in other contexts. As I gave the example earlier of someone who is creating a carousel for their specific needs. What's great about a really well-designed solid web component is that it should allow people to use that component in completely new ways that the inventor of that component didn't anticipate. And I think that's going to be really sort of powerful to see what people can create. We spend, Rob and I have done some consideration of what portion of a typical application is implementing or re-implementing behavior that's pretty standard. So it turns out if you look at a typical app, its code base, a web app, something like on the order of half its code is going to end up, the UI code will end up re-implementing UI patterns that have been worked out many times before. So they'll have, if you look at a website, if it's got a menu bar, well, there's a zillion menu bars, but someone went and coded another one. And, and whether it's a shopping cart or a login flow, like a lot of this stuff has been done before. So if you think about, if that's true, maybe half of our front-end development time is kind of wasted doing stuff that's really not core to our app's value. Like, it's not unique to what we're trying to solve. If you're a real estate site, like, you don't want to be re-implementing, carousels. Like, you want to be coming up with great UI for helping people find properties. And so, I think that, if we can solve this reusability problem and allow people to reuse UI in a more predictable, reliable way, that should free up a lot of resources to focus on making, better UI that's unique and really tuned for their specific problem.
Ben Issa gave a very popular talk at the London Polymer Conference back in October of 2016. And one of the things that he pointed out was, when you're building applications, as they are at IMG under Ben's leadership, that you first look for existing code to use. So reuse and only implement where there are holes in what you're able to find out there. So that's almost an obvious strategy. But as a consumer for reusable elements, how do you know what's going to work well with your system? And this is where the gold standard comes in. You can imagine that as component catalogs grow, that an attribute of a component might be some level of specification to the degree that it supports the gold standard. Or even if it just notes that the component author is aware of the gold standard and strives to meet a percentage of that, that's a big step up from the general space of, well, I wrote this over the weekend and it's kind of cool because it displays pet cats or something like that.
Yeah, I wonder, those, when you buy a consumer electronics device and you turn it over and look underneath it, there's these little symbols like CE or UL, or I don't even know what those mean. Like, I think it means that someone took the laptop and dropped it in a bathtub or something and, confirmed that it didn't burn down their building.
My kids.
Your kids are working for Underwriters Laboratory. I think that maybe like Rob says, like maybe we need something like that where you can pick up a component and kind of look underneath it and see like, oh yeah, it's got this, gold standard seal. So I don't have to worry about whether it's going to handle attributes correctly or process content changes. Like I know that it's going to do that.
And well-written components that way, it's not just a matter of plugging it into your application and letting it play, although it's a large aspect of it. But it's a starting point. It's a base component, it's a base library for building customization on top of it. If you're complying with the gold standard, you have a much greater probability of component author then being able to extend on top of it and to build their customization. So it's not just a piece to plug and play in an application, but it's also a starter set for continuing your own organization's componentization of your code base that way. So knowing that there's a level of quality built in, that there's an understanding of various composability issues, of performance issues, of accessibility and all of that, being able to start with that as a base to work off of is highly compelling for any development shop.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we kind of push that idea that, the gold standard is like a badge of honor, which will encourage so many more people to, be able to spare the time to kind of put that stamp on their components, which is obviously going to, increase the accessibility to the web for so many people, because like you're almost saying, you'd be spending more time solving the problem that you're supposed to be solving and not reinventing 8 things which have been done a million times before. I think it's really important that as a community you kind of push the gold standard forward and really get people to strive to kind of meet those that checklist. So on that note, have you guys got any other plans or any other ideas of how to increase awareness of the gold standard or kind of make it more attractive for people to implement? Have you got any ideas?
That's a great question. I think one thing that we think will be a big difference will be creating components that meet that standard and promoting those. So that's a project that we've got going on. I think that when people can see live examples of, a component that meets the standard and can understand, there's documentation explaining what it's doing, why it's doing it, I think that'll be fairly compelling, that someone will, feel like that's a standard that they want to measure up to. I think it'll also come up as, as the more people know about it and are discussing it and encouraging people to do it. So, for example, at the remote conference on web components last month, I think I gave a talk in which I mentioned gold standard, but 2 other people mentioned it as well. So I think that that's a good sign that people are aware of issues like performance, like accessibility, and as they talk about those things, if someone says, "Well, how do I make my component accessible?" To have a place to point people and say, "Well, go check this. Make sure you're complying with this list." I think that's a great start.
Yeah, I think examples are kind of a really important thing, so, you mentioned creating components that kind of meet this gold standard, but even specific examples of how to meet a specific point on that checklist. So, for example, a user can kind of scroll down the list and go, API, exposed events. And they're like, okay, so that looks like a really good thing to do. How exactly do I do that? And then they've got example code, which they can reuse. And I think those kind of things will help. Obviously, that's a lot of work. I mean, there's lots of items on this list, and we're going to need a lot of help from a lot of developers to kind of, help out with that. So, it's a good thing to kind of evangelize.
Yeah, as Rob said earlier on, there's a lot of work that remains ahead of us. It's not like this thing is finished. It's a working draft. So in some cases where we've had, like I had a great dialogue with Rob Dodson back in January, I think, where he and I and a few other people had been discussing this point about whether setting a property on a web component should always raise a change event. It's kind of an obscure topic, but if you have like an input element and it's a checkbox, if you check the checkbox in the UI, it'll raise a change event so that the outer app knows that the checkbox state has changed. But if you set the checked property on that input element, it won't raise the change event. because it assumes that, hey, well, you're the application, you changed the check property. I don't need to tell you that it changed. You can do whatever else you want to do. And that was surprising to me. I hadn't known that or understood sort of the motivations for it. So we got into that and talked a bit about browser performance and how avoiding a lot of event spam helps the browser stay fast. So in the course of talking through that, I was able to compile the things that I was learning about that topic and document those in an article behind the relevant gold standard item. So I think that's happened in a few places where we've been able to really go into details and have sample code and explain some of the background information. But we need a lot more of that, like you say. If someone wants to go through it, we'd love to have someone be able to get as much detail as they need to understand the motivation for why something's important, and then the instructions for how to meet that criteria.
I think as people look through the gold standard, as we hope they do, to recognize this is very open. There's no magic, there's no deep technical knowledge around this. What we need is more input from the community as to fleshing out these gold standard items. And it's something that just about anybody familiar with how HTML elements work can contribute to. Think about the corner cases, think about what makes a particular element work naturally, and don't feel shy about contributing to that list, to add those items that are missing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're just about running up on time now, and just before we kind of finish up, I'd just like to mention that we've got Jan and Rob coming on again on Wednesday, the 12th of April, to talk about the Elix project, which is very well, very nicely tied into the gold standard. So I'd like to encourage everybody that's listening to, listen to the Elix episode on the 12th of April. So just a shout out for that.
Yeah.
So is there anything we missed? Probably a lot. I mean, I miss things constantly. But is there anything particular to today's thing we've particularly missed that we should touch on as we wrap up?
One thought I'd leave developers that are listening to this episode. I would they may be saying, okay, well, what am I supposed to do with this list? Like maybe they follow the link, they read it. So I think the thought that I'd leave them with would be, if they're in development or test, to think about adopting this as a starting point for their web component quality checks, that they think about, saying, okay, we're going to adopt this. We're going to take a shot at using this in our own practice. Let's pick a web component that we've already got and see if it meets this need. Because the list is going to get a lot better when people are actually using it. And I think that it's something that any team could start doing that's decided to invest in web components.
And I really appreciate Leon's tie-in to the April 12th talk on Elix, because a natural extension of this conversation is, what does a reference library, reference set of components look like that tries to implement to the gold standard level? And then when you talk about documentation and code examples, that component set, that library, serves as a perfect example for code that covers many of these gold standard cases.
Excellent. So thank you ever so much for coming on. It's been a brilliant episode, some amazing stories. So I look forward to that next time.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you.
So I believe this has been episode 126 of the Web Platform Podcast. We are your hosts, Justin Ribeiro
And Leon Revel.
And we will see you next week.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.